Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really complex time here, the period right after World War One.
Yeah,
It was a moment when, the world was really desperate for lasting peace.
absolutely.
But simmering just below the surface were these massive unresolved issues, especially from the Treaty of Versailles.
Exactly. That hope for the war to end all wars.
Yeah.
It started to fade pretty quickly. Despite some real effort, the foundations for peace were just incredibly fragile.
And our mission in this deep dive is to really trace that path. How did the world go from that sort of relative calm, even optimism with the 1920s,
Mm-hmm.
to global conflict by 1939, and then eventually see the U.S. drawn in by 41?
Right. And we'll be digging into sources that look at, well, everything really.
Yeah.
Attempts at international cooperation, the crushing weight of economic collapse like the Great Depression,
Huge factor.
significant shifts in American foreign policy, and of course the rise of these aggressive regimes and their actions that, well, mostly went unchecked.
Think of it as trying to figure out how, despite these real efforts to stop another war, things just completely fell apart. We're going to highlight some maybe surprising connections and key turning points, all drawn from the material you shared. So let's jump in.
Okay, let's start with the aftermath of World War I. There was this concerted effort to build a system of collective security in the 1920s, basically a way for nations to work together to prevent aggression.
But right away, you hit the Treaty of Versailles. Our sources really hammer home how it, well, severely punished Germany, economically, territorially.
Oh, yeah. And it also sidelined a lot of Woodrow Wilson's more, shall we say, conciliatory ideas from his 14 points.
So the intended cornerstone of this new system was the League of Nations.
Right. But it was kind of crippled from the get-go. I mean, key global players, the U.S., the USSR, Germany, they weren't initially members.
Then the U.S. Senate refusing to even join the League's court. That was a big blow, wasn't it?
Huge. It really tells you something about the League's potential effectiveness.
So how effective was it then?
Well, it could help sometimes with disputes between, smaller nations. But when it came to the major powers flexing their muscles, the League ultimately proved pretty powerless. It just couldn't compel action against countries like Japan or Italy or later Germany.
Meanwhile, there were other attempts going on, right? Like the Washington Disarmament Conference in 21, 22, trying to slow down the naval arms race.
Exactly. Between the U.S., Japan, and Britain mainly, and trying to iron out some issues in the Pacific.
And they came up with things like the Five-Power Treaty, that 5-5-3 ratio for battleships.
Yes, that famous ratio. But the crucial takeaway from our sources on these agreements, their fundamental weakness, they completely lacked any kind of enforcement mechanism.
No teeth.
Zero teeth. One source puts it pretty bluntly, suggesting the U.S. naively gave Japan the advantage in the Pacific by agreeing to these limits, even while, managing to keep the open door policy for China trade alive.
That's fascinating, trying to prevent war by limiting ships, but maybe doing it in a way that actually emboldened a potential rival.
Absolutely. Then you get the Locarno Pact in 1926, Western Europe. This felt like a really hopeful moment.
Yeah.
Germany, France, Belgium agreeing to guarantee borders, settle disputes peacefully, especially with Germany's eastern neighbors. People talked about the spirit of Locarno. There was this real feeling that maybe war in Europe was finally over.
And building on that desire to outlaw war, you get the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928.
Right. Signed by 62 nations.
Yeah.
Making war illegal except in self-defense. Looked great on paper.
Sounded amazing. Global peace, finally.
It sounded good. But this pact really highlights a major flaw of the whole era. Again, no enforcement mechanism at all.
And that loophole.
The self-defense loophole was massive. Any nation could just claim its aggression was purely defensive. And this, our sources point out, fostered a really dangerous false sense of security, particularly in the United States, right through the 1930s.
And what's really key here, something the sources link tightly, is how these diplomatic failings were intertwined with the whole economic situation. War debts, reparations.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. was the main creditor nation after World War I. The Allies owed something like, $16 billion? A staggering amount.
But they were counting on Germany paying massive reparations to them first.
Right. And America's own high tariff policies at the time made it incredibly difficult for European countries, especially Germany, to actually earn the money they needed to pay those debts. Germany's economy was just buckling under the pressure, collapsing in 1923.
So they cook up the Dawes Plan in 1924, this complex financial merry-go-round. How did that actually work? And why do our sources call it so fragile?
Okay, so basically, U.S. bankers loan money to Germany.
Right.
Germany uses that money to pay reparations to Britain and France.
Okay.
And then Britain and France use those payments to repay their war debts back to the
If
U.S.
the money just goes in a circle.
Pretty much. A
Yeah.
system completely propped up by U.S. credit. And it kind of worked for a
Yeah.
while until the 1929 U.S. stock market crash just pulled the rug out from under the whole thing.
And once the crash hit, Hoover declares a debt moratorium in 31. What was the fallout from that?
Big fallout. Almost every debtor nation defaulted,
Right.
except Finland, interestingly.
Really? Just Finland.
Just Finland. And this created, well, significant resentment towards the U.S. in Europe, which in turn kind of fed into the American public and politicians pushing harder for neutrality later on. That feeling of, hey, we got burned helping last time, let's just stay out of it.
Which brings us neatly to the next major turning point, the Great Depression. It wasn't just an economic crisis, was it? Our sources really emphasize it as a major cause of the rise of totalitarian regimes.
That's such a critical insight,
Yeah.
particularly in Japan and Germany. The U.S. crash sets off this worldwide depression, and it just devastates economies everywhere.
Germany facing like 50% unemployment, hyperinflation.
Catastrophic levels.
Mhm.
And Japan, their crucial exports just plummeted, cut in half between 29 and 31.
And who did Japan blame for their economic mess?
They largely pointed the finger at the West's protectionist trade policies, specifically citing high tariffs like those in the U.S. So this economic frustration, mixed with resentment over things like the naval treaties limiting them, it really fueled militarism and political instability in Japan. It even led to the assassination of their prime minister in 1930.
Wow. So amidst all this global turmoil, American foreign policy starts shifting too, right? Early 30s, especially under FDR, we see the good neighbor policy towards Latin America taking shape.
Yeah, and it wasn't entirely sudden. There were moves to improve relations even before FDR. Things like pulling troops out of places, resolving the Mexico oil crisis peacefully back in 28.
And the Clark Memorandum, that was a shift away from Teddy Roosevelt's big stick.
Exactly. It basically said the U.S. wouldn't intervene just for its own purposes anymore. A big change, theoretically.
So what made FDR's good neighbor policy significant in this context, with aggression rising elsewhere?
Well, it was framed partly as a reaction to that overseas aggression. Fostering unity in the Western Hemisphere seemed pretty crucial. The big emphasis was non-intervention and cooperation.
Like at the Montevideo Conference in 33, Cordell Hull's statement.
That famous declaration, no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. Pretty clear.
And they actually followed through based on the sources. Troops out of Nicaragua, Haiti, staying out of Cuba's internal stuff, repealing the Platt Amendment, though they kept Guantanamo.
Right. Arbitration agreed at Buenos Aires. And significantly, they didn't intervene when Mexico nationalized its oil industry, even though U.S. companies lost out big time. That commitment was restated in 38 and 39, too.
This commitment to non-intervention in the hemisphere, it's kind of an interesting contrast to the U.S. approach to global economic issues, like the London Economic Conference in 33.
Yeah, that conference was supposed to be this big global effort. 66 nations trying to tackle a depression, stabilize currencies, boost trade.
But FDR basically torpedoed it, didn't he?
He did. He wouldn't agree to put the U.S. back on the gold standard then. And the sources suggest this action actually led to more international isolationism and extreme nationalism globally. Nations just retreated further inward economically.
Although, on a more positive trade note, Cordell Hull was successful in getting U.S. tariffs reduced. Why was that such a big deal?
Well, it was partly about relief and recovery, kind of linked to the good neighbor idea, but historically, huge. It reversed decades of high tariff policy going way back, policies that had really choked international trade and hurt recovery after World War I.
So it paved the way for the post-WWII system.
Exactly. It really laid the groundwork for that freer global trade system. Hull negotiated pacts with like 21 countries by 1939. It boosted U.S. trade and definitely helped relations, especially in Latin America.
FDR also made that call to recognize the USSR in late 33. Why then? Other nations had already done it.
Yeah, it was pragmatic. He hoped it might bump to the Soviets against Japan's rising power, and there was always the hope for more trade.
Did it work out?
Well, the Soviets promised to stop communist propaganda in the U.S., but our sources say they break that pledge pretty quickly when a big U.S. loan didn't materialize. So, mixed results at best.
And then there's the Philippines, the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 34, promising independence after 10 years.
Right, building on earlier promises, but this set a definite timeline. And there were several domestic pressures pushing for it.
Oh, what?
Organized labor wanted to keep out low-wage Filipino
Yeah.
workers. U.S. sugar producers wanted less competition. And of course, the isolationists just wanted to shed what they saw as a liability way out in the Far East.
And one source makes a really critical point about how Japan might have viewed this.
Yes, it suggests Japan saw the U.S. giving up possessions in the Far East as a sign of weakness, or maybe an unwillingness to really fight for its interests out there. Kind of encouraging, in a way.
That's a crucial connection. So while the U.S. is trying these different approaches, the core problem isn't going away. That failure of collective security and the really alarming rise of totalitarianism.
Exactly. Regimes seeking total control. You had fascism glorifying the state, expansion through force, Mussolini in Italy since 22, the Japanese military taking over in the early 30s, Hitler grabbing power in Germany in 33.
And you can't forget Stalin's communism in the USSR, consolidating into a pretty ruthless dictatorship through the 30s.
Okay, so let's trace how these regimes started acting out. The first really big move we look at is Japan invading Manchuria in 1931.
The League of Nations condemned it, right? But what was the critical flaw in their response?
Zero enforcement, absolutely none. Japan violated multiple treaties, like the Kellogg-Briand Pact they'd signed.
The one outlawing war.
Right, but the League couldn't or wouldn't do anything meaningful. The U.S. response, the Hoover-Stimson Doctrine, was basically saying, we won't recognize your conquest of Manchukuo, but also refusing any actual sanctions, economic or political.
And Japan's response.
They just walked out of the League. Simple as that.
Why was Japan pushing so hard into Manchuria? The sources give a few reasons.
Yeah, several. A desperate need for raw materials, coal, iron. A desire for more living space for their population, which was partly fueled by anger over immigration restrictions from places like the U.S.
That 1924 act banning Asians specifically.
That's the one they cited. Plus economic frustration over tariffs hitting their exports and just resentment about being treated as unequal in those naval treaties.
And this pattern just continued, didn't it? Aggression and inaction from the international community.
It did. In 1934, Japan ditched the Washington Naval Treaty limits altogether and started a massive naval buildup. Then they signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany in 36, supposedly against communism, but really aligning themselves. And finally, the Tripartite Pact in 1940, formally creating the Axis powers with Italy, too.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, Mussolini invades Ethiopia in 1935, pretty openly aiming to rebuild the Roman Empire's glory.
Yeah. And the League did impose sanctions this time. But tellingly, they made an exception for oil.
The one thing Italy really needed for its war machine.
Exactly. And then, just a few months later, they lifted the sanctions entirely anyway. That moment is often seen as the real death knell for the League's credibility. It failed the big test against a major aggressor.
So how is the American public reacting to all this aggression piling up overseas?
By mostly retreating deeper into isolationism. People were consumed by the Great Depression at home. There was this widespread feeling that World War I had been a huge mistake, maybe even fueled by greedy bankers and arms manufacturers, the merchants of death.
Ah, yes, the Nye Committee investigation. That really pushed that narrative, didn't it?
It did. It argued WWI was needless and that financial interests dragged the U.S. in. Now, our sources suggest the committee's methods were, let's say, flawed, maybe overly anti-business by today's standards.
Its impact was huge.
Immense. It directly fueled the passage of the Neutrality Acts between 1935 and 1937.
And these acts were designed specifically to keep the U.S. out of future wars.
Right.
Automatically.
That was the idea. They prohibited selling arms, making loans, or giving credit to any nation at war. American citizens were forbidden from traveling on ships of warring nations, a complete reversal from WWI policy. Even non-military goods could only be sold on a cash-and-carry basis. Pay cash up front and transport it on your own ships. No U.S. ships in harm's way. And they specifically banned any involvement in the Spanish Civil War, too.
So these laws really tied the president's hands when it came to foreign policy, and the U.S. wasn't building up its military either.
No. There was this belief that big navies caused wars, plus nobody wanted to spend taxpayer money during the Depression.
That inaction really comes into focus with the Spanish Civil War, starting in 36. Franco's nationalists aiming for a fascist state against the Democratic Republican government.
Yeah. And the U.S., under those Neutrality Acts, applied the arms embargo to both sides.
Including the democratically elected government they might have sympathized with.
Exactly, which had devastating international implications.
Yeah.
The democracies basically stood by and watched as the loyalist government was defeated. Meanwhile, fascist Italy sent troops, and Hitler sent the Luftwaffe.
Using Spain as a testing ground for bombing civilians.
Precisely. Testing tactics, equipment. The Rome-Berlin Axis directly helped Franco win by 1939, installing fascism in Spain. And our sources are clear. This weakness, this inaction by the democracies, it significantly emboldened Hitler and Mussolini. They saw they could get away with it.
And while that's happening in Europe, Japan is escalating its war in Asia, launching a full-scale attack into southern China in 1937.
Right, pushing down from Manchuria. They declared a new order in Asia, pushing out foreign businesses, aiming for Japanese economic dominance. Basically, the end of the open-door policy the U.S. had championed for decades.
This leads to the Panay incident in December 37. What exactly happened there?
Japanese planes bombed and sank a clearly marked U.S. gunboat, the Panay, plus some oil tankers, on the Yangtze River, which was supposed to be an international waterway by treaty.
Casualties.
2 Americans killed, about 30 wounded. Our sources frame this as Japan testing U.S. resolve, kind of like Hitler testing the waters in the Rhineland in 36.
Roosevelt was angry, apparently. But how did the American public react?
Overwhelmingly, they called for the U.S. to just pull out of China, prioritize staying out of conflict above all else.
So Japan apologized.
They did. Paid an indemnity, promised it wouldn't happen again. Washington accepted it. But the source notes that the Japanese military interpreted the relatively mild U.S. response as basically a green light to mistreat American civilians in China more broadly.
Around the same time, FDR gives his quarantine speech, October 37, condemning Japan and Italy, suggesting democracies should quarantine aggressors, maybe through economic embargoes.
Yeah, he floated the idea.
How did that go down?
Badly. Isolationists in the U.S. went ballistic, fearing it was a step towards war. FDR, ever sensitive to public opinion and hampered by the Neutrality Acts, basically had to back down from that more direct approach. He had to find other, less confrontational ways.
So American isolationism holds firm, even as German aggression in Europe just keeps ramping up. Hitler pulls out of the League in 33, starts openly defying Versailles by 37, absorbs Austria in March 38, the Anschluss.
Right. And this is where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his policy of appeasement really takes center stage.
Appeasement meaning giving concessions to the aggressor to keep the peace.
Exactly. It was driven by this deep, deep fear of another war like WWI, widespread pacifism in Britain and France. Chamberlain actively avoided strong alliances, genuinely hoping negotiation could still work.
And U.S. isolationism, locked in by the Neutrality Acts, meant no strong pushback from across the Atlantic.
None at all. So the next target becomes Czechoslovakia. Hitler demands the Sudetenland, that border region with a large German-speaking population.
Which leads to the infamous Munich Conference in September 1938. Germany, France, the UK, Italy.
And crucially, the Czechs themselves and their supposed ally, the Soviet Union, were completely excluded from the meeting.
What were the terms agreed at Munich?
Devastating for the Czechs. They were forced to hand over the Sudetenland, even though they had a capable army and fortifications there. In return, Hitler promised it was his last territorial demand in Europe and guaranteed the independence of what was left as Czechoslovakia.
The Czechs felt utterly betrayed, and Chamberlain flies home declaring peace for our time.
Yeah. Many in Europe genuinely breathed a sigh of relief, thinking war had been dodged.
But that illusion didn't last long.
Not at all. Just 6 months later, March 1939, Hitler breaks his Munich promise and invades the rest of Czechoslovakia. Appeasement was clearly disastrously bankrupt.
And just a week after that, Hitler demands the Polish port city of Danzig and access through the Polish corridor.
This time, though, Britain, under Chamberlain, finally drew a line. They stated they would aid Poland if attacked. France followed suit.
But then came the final, shocking twist just before the invasion, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, August 23, 1939.
The world was absolutely stunned. Fascists and communists, supposed mortal enemies, signing a pact.
Why did they do it?
Hitler wanted to avoid fighting a two-front war when he invaded Poland. Stalin, his own army weakened by his purges, feared Hitler and basically wanted to buy time and grab some territory in Eastern Europe as a buffer.
So the public part was non-aggression, but the secret part?
The secret clause carved up Poland between them. It also guaranteed the Soviets would sell vital raw materials to Germany. This pact essentially gave Hitler the green light he needed for Poland.
And then, September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, using that new tactic, Blitzkrieg.
Lightning war, fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, overwhelming air power with the Luftwaffe. Devastatingly effective.
2 days later, September 3rd, Britain and France declare war on Germany. World War II had begun.
And back in the U.S., on September 5th, FDR officially proclaims the nation neutral, though, as we'll see, that neutrality would be increasingly strained.
So we have the basic sides forming. Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan eventually versus the Allies, initially UK and France, later joined by the USSR and the US.
Right. And Germany's blitzkrieg rolls through Poland. Warsaw surrenders by September 27th. At the same time, the Soviet Union moves in from the east, taking their share of Poland under the secret pact, annexing the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and invading Finland in the brutal Winter War. Stalin's clearly fortifying his western border, anticipating Hitler might turn on him eventually.
Facing this onslaught, Britain and France desperately need weapons and supplies. But the U.S. Neutrality Act of 1937 still forbade selling them arms, right?
Right. So FDR, while proclaiming official neutrality, made it clear he wasn't neutral in thought. Public opinion polls showed Americans overwhelmingly supported Britain and France, like 84%.
So he persuades Congress to revise the law.
Yes, leading to the Neutrality Act of 1939. This allowed limited aid. The key change was permitting the sale of weapons to European democracies, but strictly on a cash-and-carry basis.
Explain cash and carry again. Why was that specific approach taken?
It was designed to avoid the exact problems that dragged the U.S. into WWI. No loans means no war debts tying the U.S. to one side. No U.S. ships carrying the weapons means no risk of them being sunk by German U-boats and creating an incident. Belligerents had to pay cash up front and use their own ships to transport the goods.
And FDR could also declare danger zones where U.S. ships couldn't go.
Exactly, the practical result. The democracies, mainly Britain and France, who controlled the Atlantic sea lanes, benefited. They could buy U.S. arms. The Axis powers couldn't. Plus, it gave the U.S. economy a much-needed boost, helping finally end the Great Depression's unemployment crisis.
Germany's expansion didn't stop with Poland, of course. April, May 1940, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, they all fall.
Yeah, the Blitzkrieg just rolled over Western Europe. FDR declared Greenland, a Danish possession, covered by the Monroe Doctrine, and sent U.S. military assistance there to prevent German occupation.
And then the really stunning blow, the fall of France in June 1940.
Which did incredibly fast. German forces occupied northern and western France, installing that collaborationist Vichy government in the south. A huge shock to the world.
Next up, the Battle of Britain. Hitler assumes Britain will sue for peace after France falls.
But Churchill famously refused. So Hitler orders the Luftwaffe to gain air superiority over Britain as a prelude to invasion. They start bombing RAF airfields in August. But then, in September, they shift tactics.
To bombing London and other cities?
Yes. And our sources call this Hitler's first major mistake, or fatal blunder. By switching targets from airfields to cities, he gave the RAF crucial breathing room to recover, repair, and rebuild.
And the RAF pilots, the few?
They fought brilliantly, ultimately defeated the Luftwaffe in the skies over Britain. Hitler had to indefinitely postpone, then cancel his invasion plans. British morale, spurred by Churchill's leadership, was incredible during the Blitz.
Also in September 1940, Japan formally joins the Axis, the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy.
A defensive alliance explicitly aimed at deterring the United States from entering the war. Our sources note this pact definitely led U.S. policy towards Japan to become much more confrontational.
The war expands dramatically again in June 1941. Hitler makes what our sources call his second fatal error.
Invading the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, his long-stated goal of Lebensraum living space for Germans in Eastern Europe.
A massive invasion, but it stalls.
Stalls near Moscow, largely due to the brutal Russian winter setting in. The Germans weren't prepared for it. You also get the horrific siege of Leningrad lasting nearly 900 days.
And the U.S. eventually aids the Soviets.
Yes. Seeing the defense of Russia as ultimately vital to U.S. defense, America eventually sent $11 billion in Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets. But Hitler invading the USSR opened up that massive Eastern Front, forcing Germany into a devastating two-front war before Britain was defeated. A huge strategic error.
So throughout this period, 1939 to 41, the American response to the war in Europe is clearly intensifying.
Definitely. You have FDR's Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat in December 39. He framed the war as a direct threat to U.S. independence, arguing the Nazis aimed for world domination. Many people felt that the speech really marked America's psychological turn towards intervention.
And after the fall of France and during the Battle of Britain, FDR calls for a massive military buildup.
Huge. A giant air force, a two-ocean navy, Congress responds, appropriating an incredible $37 billion more than the entire cost of WWI, 5 times the annual New Deal budget.
And the first peacetime draft.
September 1940, the Selective Service and Training Act, registering men aged 21-35 for 1 year of training, later expanded, of course. A major step.
Also in 1940, the Havana Conference. The U.S. agrees to share responsibility for the Monroe Doctrine with Latin American republics.
Yeah, a significant shift, making the doctrine multilateral for the first time. Shared responsibility for hemisphere defense.
All this is happening while there's this fierce debate raging inside the U.S., right? Internationalism versus isolationism.
Absolutely. You had groups like the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. They were pushing the internationalist view. Axis domination is a threat to us. Fortress America isn't enough. We need to give direct aid to Britain. All methods short of war was their slogan.
FDR sympathized with them privately.
His sympathies were clearly internationalist, but he had to tread carefully with public opinion in Congress.
And on the other side, the isolationists.
The powerful America First Committee. Their slogan was pretty stark. England will fight to the last American. They argued the U.S. should only focus on defending its own shores. Key figures were Senator Robert A. Taft, promoting that Fortress America concept, and the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh.
Despite that debate, FDR keeps finding ways to help Britain, like the destroyer bases deal in September 1940.
Right. He transferred 50 older WWI destroyers, which Britain desperately needed for convoy escort, in exchange for 99-year leases on 8 valuable British base sites in the Atlantic and Caribbean.
And he did this by executive agreement, bypassing a potentially lengthy Senate debate.
He did. Critics definitely charged him with circumventing Congress, acting like a dictator. It was controversial.
Then came the 1940 election, FDR running for an unprecedented third term.
Against the Republican Wendell Willkie. Willkie actually wasn't a hardcore isolationist. He criticized FDR's style and spending, but broadly agreed on strengthening defenses and aiding the Allies short of actual war. He did accuse FDR of being a warmonger, though.
And FDR's position?
He defended the New Deal, defended aiding the Allies, but famously pledged, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." FDR won the Electoral College pretty handily, though the popular vote was closer than his previous elections.
So now re-elected for a third term, FDR feels more empowered to push further.
Seems so. In his annual message to Congress in January 1941, he delivers the famous 4 freedoms speech.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear.
Exactly. He framed the war effort in these broad, idealistic terms and asked Congress for increased authority to help Britain, whose cash reserves were running out.
And Congress responds with Lend-Lease in April 41.
Yes. Our sources call this one of the most momentous laws Congress ever passed. It basically authorized the president to lend or lease military supplies to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to the defense of the U.S. Payment could be deferred until after the war.
FDR's analogy was lending your neighbor a garden hose if their house is on fire.
That's the one. But critics, especially isolationists, hated it, called it the blank check bill, argued it was basically a declaration of war just without the shooting.
And in effect, it kind of was.
It effectively ended U.S. neutrality. It was an economic declaration of war.
Right.
U.S. war production ramped up massively. And Hitler, who had mostly avoided sinking U.S. ships up to that point, remembering how that helped bring the U.S. into WWI, began authorizing limited attacks on U.S. vessels involved in supplying Britain.
Which led to convoys.
Yep. By July 41, the U.S. Navy was escorting convoys part of the way across the Atlantic. The U.S. eventually sent about $50 billion in aid by the war's end, mostly to Britain and the USSR.
And the U.S. Navy started actively patrolling the Western Atlantic even earlier, April 41.
Right. The American Neutrality Patrol, searching for German subs, warning British ships. By July, U.S. forces were escorting Lend-Lease convoys all the way to Iceland. They also occupied Greenland and Iceland to prevent German takeover and protect the sea lanes.
Then the U-boat attacks intensified. The destroyers Kearney damaged, Reuben James sunk in October 41 with heavy loss of life.
Yes. The Reuben James lost 115 sailors. After these incidents, FDR declared a shoot-on-sight policy against German U-boats in the patrol zones. And in November 41, Congress went further, repealing the most restrictive parts of the 1939 Neutrality Act. They allowed U.S. merchant ships to be armed and to enter combat zones. The old neutrality laws were pretty much obsolete by then. The U.S. was in an undeclared naval war in the Atlantic.
Then, in August 1941, comes that secret meeting between FDR and Churchill off Newfoundland, the Atlantic Conference.
Held right after Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union. a really pivotal moment. They issued the Atlantic Charter.
What were the key points of the Atlantic Charter?
It laid out principles for the post-war world. Things like no territorial changes against the wishes of the inhabitants, self-determination, restoring governments abolished by dictators, and really importantly, it called for a permanent system of general security.
The foundation for the United Nations.
Exactly. Liberals loved it, saw echoes of Wilson's 14 points. Isolationists, of course, were furious. Here was the supposedly neutral U.S. president meeting with the leader of a belligerent nation, planning war aims together.
So by late 1941, the U.S. is deeply, if unofficially, involved in the war against Germany in the Atlantic. But the final spark, the thing that brings America fully into the global conflict, comes from the Pacific. How did that path to Pearl Harbor unfold?
Well, tensions with Japan had been building for a long, long time. Ever since the Manchurian invasion in 31, really. The U.S. refused to recognize Manchukuo, was deeply suspicious of Japan's alliances with Germany and Italy, condemned the attack on China in 37. FDR's quarantine speech was largely aimed at Japan.
And Japan had declared its ambition for that Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, basically an empire.
Yeah, an empire across East Asia and the Pacific, explicitly ending the open-door policy, pushing foreign businesses out of areas they occupied in China.
And the main U.S. response was economic pressure, embargoes.
Increasingly so. After France fell and Japan moved troops into northern French Indochina in July 1940, the U.S. embargoed things like aviation fuel, scrap iron, steel. They also loaned money to China to help its resistance. The embargo was expanded in December 40 to include more strategic materials.
Then came the really critical one, the embargo of July 1941.
That was the big one. After Japan occupied the rest of French Indochina, gaining crucial bases in the south, the U.S. froze all Japanese assets in America. They closed the Panama Canal to Japanese shipping, activated the Philippine militia under U.S. command, and most importantly, they imposed a total embargo on oil exports to Japan, along with other vital resources.
And that oil embargo was devastating for Japan.
Absolutely crippling. Japan imported almost all its oil, much of it from the U.S. This embargo forced a crisis. Tokyo felt it had to either give in to U.S. demands or seize oil resources elsewhere, which meant war.
And don't forget the Tripartite Pact from September 40. Japan joining the Axis meant an attack on one was an attack on all, aimed squarely at deterring the U.S.
Right. Also, in early 1941, FDR made that significant move of basing the U.S. Pacific Fleet forward at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, rather than on the West Coast.
The idea was to deter Japan.
To signal military readiness, act as a check on further Japanese expansion. Whether it worked as a deterrent is debatable. Some argue it just presented a more tempting target.
Negotiations between Japan and the U.S. continued through late 1941, but they were getting nowhere.
Pretty much stalled. Japan offered to pull out of southern Indochina if the U.S. lifted the oil embargo, but they absolutely refused to leave China. The U.S. demanded withdrawal from both Indochina and China, plus a promise not to attack elsewhere in the Pacific, and withdrawal from the Tripartite Pact.
No middle ground there.
None at all. Our sources suggest the U.S. negotiations were partly a delaying tactic anyway, an attempt to buy time to build up defenses in the Philippines and get that massive two-ocean Navy Congress had authorized ready.
Leadership changed in Japan in October 41, too. Hideki Tojo, a real expansionist general, became prime minister.
Yes. And secretly, the Japanese military leadership decided if no diplomatic breakthrough happened by November 25th, they would attack the United States. The final, irrevocable decision to attack was made on December 1st, even while diplomats were still talking in Washington.
Why did Japan take that massive gamble, attacking the U.S., a much larger industrial power?
They felt war was unavoidable because of the embargoes and U.S. demands. They felt backed into a corner, so they decided to seize the initiative, strike first, rather than wait and potentially grow weaker under the embargo.
Then the plan.
The plan was a swift campaign to seize the resource-rich territories they needed: the Dutch East Indies for oil, Malaya for rubber and tin, the Philippines. And they believed a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was essential to knock it out, prevent it from interfering with those conquests for maybe 6 months to a year, giving Japan time to consolidate its new empire.
What about U.S. intelligence? Did they know anything?
They had broken Japan's top diplomatic code, called Purple. In the days leading up to December 7th, from December 1st to 6th, analysts in Washington saw messages clearly indicating Japan was about to launch major attacks. But
they expected the attack elsewhere.
exactly. The prevailing assessment was that the attacks would be against British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, possibly the Philippines. Almost no one in high command believed Japan would risk a direct, unprovoked attack on U.S. territory like Hawaii, thinking it would guarantee war with the U.S., which they assumed Japan wanted to avoid if possible. Our sources are very clear. There's no credible evidence that FDR or key military leaders knew specifically that Pearl Harbor itself was the target.
And then, December 7th, 1941, a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, 7:55 a.m.
The surprise attack begins. Japanese planes hitting the ships moored in Pearl Harbor and the nearby airfields.
The damage was horrific.
Catastrophic. All 8 U.S. battleships present were sunk or badly damaged. The USS Arizona exploded, taking over 1,100 lives. The Oklahoma capsized. 10 other ships damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Over 2,500 Americans killed, more than 1,100 wounded.
But crucially, the aircraft carriers weren't there.
That was incredibly fortunate for the U.S. All 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, happened to be out at sea on maneuvers or delivering planes. Their survival proved absolutely vital for the U.S. war effort in the Pacific later on.
The Japanese losses were minimal in the attack itself.
Very light compared to the damage inflicted.
The reaction in the U.S. was immediate.
Utter shock and outrage. On December 8th, FDR went before Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, and asked for a declaration of war against Japan.
Congress approved it almost instantly.
Overwhelmingly. Only one dissenting vote in the entire Congress, Jeanette Rankin, who had also voted against WWI.
And then, just 3 days later,
Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their tripartite pact with Japan. Our sources call this Hitler's third fatal blunder. He wasn't actually obligated by the pact to declare war unless the U.S. attacked Japan first, which technically hadn't happened. Declaring war on the U.S. brought America's full industrial might into the European war against him.
So with the U.S. now fully engaged in a global war on 2 fronts, FDR and Churchill met quickly and agreed on the overall strategy.
Yes, the Germany first strategy. Despite the attack coming from Japan, they agreed the main effort should be focused on defeating Nazi Germany first, as the greater long-term threat, while still fighting a holding action against Japan in the Pacific initially. The U.S. immediately began a massive mobilization, aiming to grow the military from around 2 million to 12 million personnel by 1946.
So looking back at this incredible, complex journey,
From those hopeful, but you have to say, fundamentally flawed attempts at peace and cooperation right after World War I.
through the crushing global economic collapse that really fueled these radical political movements,
And the rise of aggressive dictatorships who just kept testing and breaking the international system with, well, increasing impunity.
to a shifting United States foreign policy, constantly wrestling with that deep-seated isolationism versus the undeniable reality of a very dangerous world.
Ultimately culminating in the attacks that finally, decisively, brought the U.S. fully into a global conflict. It's quite a sequence of events.
Yeah. Understanding the road to World War II, it really means grasping that incredibly complex interplay of political choices, economic pressures, diplomatic failures, choices and failures made by many nations over 2 decades.
And for you listening today, these events, they really serve as a powerful reminder, don't they? How interconnected global forces truly are. Economic hardship, the breakdown of international systems, unchecked aggression in what might seem like distant parts of the world. It can all have unforeseen and devastating consequences, even pulling in nations absolutely determined to stay out.
Which really leads to an important question for you to think about. How did those specific failures of collective security we talked about, combined with the intense economic pressures of the 1930s, create such uniquely fertile ground for that unchecked aggression? And maybe more importantly, what does that historical lesson suggest about the stability of peace in our world today, especially when we face similar challenges like economic hardship or rising international disunity? Something to consider.